we live in communities. We huddle together in these groups of people living in the same sort of shared geographic space. And we're living at a time of technological advancement, in a time where we are increasingly globalized, and at a time where we are increasingly disconnected from each other. Certainly we can go and find out the latest news from around the world, as well as know the most intimate details of our favorite celebrity, but we very seldom know the name of our next-door neighbor. Nor have we met the local city council person who might be making decisions about our future. So while we might have opinions about the big issues around the world, we don't often pay attention to those local public policy decisions that affect our lives much more immediately and much more profoundly. It didn't used to be like this. We didn't used to be this disconnected. In fact, when this country was founded, it was founded on the principle of people coming together to create something new, a democratic experiment that was world-shaking. In fact, in 1831, a guy named Alexis de Tocqueville came to visit America to see this sort of experiment in action. And he was astonished at how people kept coming together in these sort of associations to make this country work. And he ended up concluding that the health of a democratic society may be measured by the quality of functions performed by private citizens. Now, why would that be so? See, democracy is about creating a government. But one of the things we've learned about governments, democratic governments, is that the government doesn't have enough power or resources to solve all of the problems that we need it to have. So our great social compact feels unfulfilled because government isn't doing everything that we want it to do. And if government had that level of power or resources, we'd call it tyranny, and we'd try to overthrow it. And so it doesn't work. And so we've turned to something else to try to make this American experiment work, and that's turning to private business, the market sector, where we think that the invisible hand of economics, the private business, will be able to fill those gaps in the social compact. That together with government and private industry, we can work together, a free government and a free market economy, and be able to create worthwhile communities that enhance the quality of life of people in those communities. And yet, one thing we know about market economies is there's always someone on the outside looking in or on the bottom looking up. Simply put, it doesn't work like that. It's not enough to be able to solve what we need in our local communities. What's missing is a third sector, a community sector, an independent sector. The sector that's filled full of individual volunteers and organized nonprofits who are associating together for the public good and filling those gaps in our societal compact. The ones who are doing what needs to happen in order for needs to be met, dreams to be realized, and for our entire community to move forward. You know, when I grew up learning a little bit about how democracies worked, and this idea of government was something pretty astonishing to me. I thought it was pretty neat, and I thought I could be a part of that. But what I learned was on how government worked was something the Schoolhouse Rock taught me on how a bill became a law, right? You saw that. I remember learning in Civic class about there's 3 branches of government. History class taught me about the Constitution and how it was amended and so we could become free. And I thought that government and governance were the same thing. That our job as citizens was to vote for someone to be in elected office, and they would make the decisions, and we got to sit on the sidelines and complain about things, right? And that was how things worked, that they did the governing and we did the whining, and together we moved forward. And so when I turned 18, I was really excited because then I could register to vote and to do my civic duty. And yet now I'm starting to see that governance in a community can be so much more, so much bigger. And then something happened to really change my perspective. 15 years ago, I joined an organization called JCCI, the Jacksonville Community Council, Inc. And it was an exciting experience for me. I had come from a helping profession. I'm a social worker by trade. And I had been feeling good about doing good. I'd been working with children and families and homelessness and mental illness. And I had been involved in this changing people's lives and feeling like I was making a difference in the world. And suddenly I found myself in an organization that held a lot of meetings. We met about everything, and people would come in for these meetings, and we would talk about things, and we'd talk about public policy. And I thought over and over that first year, have I made a mistake? I began to question my choices. What happened to making a difference in the world? But sometime during that first year, I started to see something happen. I saw people coming together who normally wouldn't come together, having conversations that normally wouldn't happen, talking about things in ways that nobody had been talking about before. I saw people coming together and creating new ideas, shaping new public policy, building new programs, transforming lives. In short, what I really saw was the power of civic engagement. And I saw that civic engagement in action, making something happen, making something miraculous, making something real. Now, one of the things I learned in that is that civic engagement is more than just this voting that we used to think about civic engagement was. What I learned is that civic engagement at its core really is the most important factor in making communities work. You see, governments can function, they can pass laws, they can make decisions, but you don't get the quality of life you really want in a community unless everybody's a part of that, unless everybody's a part of making those decisions and working on those things that matter most. And I discovered that communities, and all nations around the world have two big questions that they have to answer. The first question is, what matters most? You see, policies and programs and budgets and actions are all built on values. Those values drive what we do. They drive what's important. They drive what we measure. They drive everything that we do. The values of a community are manifest in the kinds of policies and programs and actions and budgets that get enacted and made real and are reflected in the lives of the people who live in that community. So the most important question is a community has to decide is what matters most? What do you value? But the second question often will determine the answer to the first question, and that is, who gets to decide? Who's allowed to tell you what matters most? You see, if you have a system where the only people involved are government and private business, you might end up with a system that, favored incumbency and created income inequalities. And you wouldn't want that to happen. What we find is that as people get involved in communities and start to share the things they value, they transform the values of communities. They transform the policies that a community pays attention to. They change the definition of success that a community has for itself. And you start to see a very different kind of democracy playing out in the community. In fact, that's the only way you can make democracy work. And by work, I'm talking about that stuff, that government by the people, for the people, of the people, the stuff Lincoln used to talk about. Right? That's the kind of thing that starts to happen when you start inviting people into those conversations. Let me tell you a couple of stories about what this looks like in communities. Here in Jacksonville, Florida, we live in a community that is tainted by a legacy of slavery and segregation. And we started looking at issues of race in our community, and we weren't doing a very good job of addressing it. And so we brought together 300 people to have a different kind of conversation and find a new approach to how we dealt with race and race-based disparities. Now, these 300 people met weekly for 9 months to have this different kind of conversation, and this wasn't just your usual suspect. This was a group of unusual suspects. We had 3 white supremacist organizations represented in the room, sitting shoulder to shoulder with people who had marched with Dr. Martin Luther King. We had people who had suffered under segregation, and people had only read about it in history books. And they came together, and they challenged each other's perceptions. They shared each other's stories. They looked at data. They began to have a different kind of conversation, and at the end, they reached a set of recommendations by consensus that said, here's what our community needs to do differently. And then they put those recommendations into action. And we started to see change. We saw achievement gaps in our public education system start to close. We saw health disparities shrink. We saw a conversation change to start looking at those structural and institutional racism that was behind some of the policies and practices of our institutions. And we started to see a different approach to what we were dealing with race. I started to see the same thing in other places. In Londrina, Brazil, it's a community that decided that they were going to end third world poverty in their community. And they did it. And they did it by bringing together government and business and academia and residents and having a new kind of conversation and envisioning a new kind of economy in which everyone was allowed to participate. A neighboring community created a citizens' observatory where ordinary people sat down and looked at every single expenditure of local government. That first year, they saved millions of dollars, which then they reallocated toward the services that the residents said they needed, and the community prospered. We're seeing this in places around the world. In San Antonio, Texas, a community came together to envision a new kind of future, and they began to reinvigorate the city with this belief of what they could and should become. They created a vision of themselves as a brain power community. And by working together, by pulling together regular people, ordinary folk, with business and government, but regular people together, working together and sharing ideas and dreams for a new future, they went from a brain drain community to a brain gain community in 3 years. They transformed their local economy to one of the strongest in the United States. And they worked on issues of health in their community. They were tired of being known as one of the fattest cities in America. And so they worked together and put salad bars in their school system and public events which involved healthy activities, and they tackled the complex issues and the simple issues, down to taking care of stray dogs in neighborhoods where people were afraid to walk or jog. And what they saw was their adult obesity rates dropped 20% in 3 years. And now they're on the fittest cities in America list. These things happen when people come together to transform communities. But this community engagement doesn't just change the community. It changes the people in it. People become different as they move from the sidelines where they have been complaining about government and writing letters to the editor into moving to the middle of the action, where now they're coming together to learn about the community, to engage in problem solving and act to make positive change. They gain a responsibility and a sense of pride about the community in which they live. And it starts to transform them and create connections among other people in their community. And suddenly you find a community full of people connected to each other, working together on a common vision and a common cause, and the community transforms and the people transform. And what you have in practice is what Alexis de Tocqueville found when he came in 1831 and was astonished at these public associations around this country of America. Suzanne Morse once said that democracy becomes real for people when they decide what kind of community they want. She said that's the leverage it might take to change our own destiny. Those are the kinds of things we're seeing in conversations all around the world as people are trying to figure out a new definition of success for nations and a new way of engaging people close to home. This last month, we had someone come in from Egypt who spent a month with us to think about and learn about how to engage people differently in his country. You see, he had learned firsthand that changing government doesn't automatically create freedom and prosperity for all. That what you need is a change in governance itself. And he was looking for new ways to engage people in his community, to create something new for his country. These are the kinds of stories and things we're seeing around the world right now as people understand the power of civic engagement. But you understand it. You've lived it. You're part of it. You know how to connect. See, the thing is, we live in communities. We live in groups of people sharing this geographic space. But we have an opportunity to do more. We have an opportunity to connect in communities and connect with each other to create something better and bigger than ourselves and to become part of something that fulfills the promises that were made a couple of hundred years ago. This is our opportunity to do something better, to believe in a better future. You see, the future of our communities is not going to be built in Washington or Brussels or Berlin. It's going to be built by you and me. And so I urge you to connect to each other, to connect to your communities, to engage in a new kind of conversation, to engage in a new kind of experience, and to create the kind of community that you know, we all know, that we deserve and that we need to have for ourselves and for our children, because this is our history, but this is also our future. Thank you.